Welcome to the Wild Side. I'm your host, Kight, and that was Bonnie Raitt singing Valley of Pain. And that song is an introduction to our topic today, which is the pain of migraines. And migraines are, unfortunately, very close to my heart because these have pretty much shaped the bulk of my life since I was 12 or 13 years old. And they are a huge influence on what I do and when I do it and how I feel on a daily basis. And actually, it turns out that I am only one person of many, many people who feel the same way about migraines. And so I thought it would be quite interesting to kind of delve into the science of migraines so that I could understand it a little bit better, and also so that I could share it with you, because chances are a good number of you guys who are listening are also sufferers of migraine. And I say that because migraines are known to be the most common neurological condition in the developed world. Altogether, they are more prevalent than diabetes plus epilepsy plus asthma altogether. And in the UK, there are some 8 million people or so who are thought to have a migraine, who are thought to be afflicted with migraine in general. In a current year, there are as many as hundreds of millions of migraines that are thought to be suffered across the country. And these are also prevalent worldwide, so migraines are thought to be one of the 3 most common conditions, next to anemia and hearing loss, that affect people around the globe. Each year, approximately 25 million days are lost from school or work or other activities because people have migraines. So that means that there are a lot of people who aren't able to go and function in a normal way, and they experience some detriment to earning money, to having relationships with their family and friends, and to doing the things that they want to do in their daily lives. And so obviously this is a really important issue, both kind of psychologically and also economically. And despite the serious economic impact of migraine, it is the least publicly funded of all neurological illnesses. So it's really something that we should be more aware of and talk more about, and hopefully eventually give some more money to. Because right now we have some money going into pharmaceuticals trying to make us feel better once we have migraines, but not a whole lot of money that's being put into understanding why migraines develop to begin with. And that's really what you need to know in order to really start targeting them. So to start off with today, I first want to think about what are headaches in general. And there are 2 broad categories of headache disorders. And the first type is a primary headache disorder. And this is a group of headaches that are identified by the presence of particular symptoms. So this group includes things like migraines and tension headaches and cluster headaches. And I'll talk in more detail about all of those in a minute. And the other group contains headaches that are caused by particular events or activities, and these are called secondary headache disorders. And this group includes headaches that are associated with things like head injuries and drugs and infection. And today I'm really going to be focusing in on that primary headache disorder category because it is the one that contains migraines, and I do predominantly want to talk about migraines today. However, I think it's quite important to start off by thinking about the differences between quote-unquote regular headaches and migraines, because it's really important to be able to recognize the two and differentiate between them so that you can treat them yourself, or so that you can describe them to your GP in a useful way so that he or she can get you the kind of treatment and recommend the certain life changes that you might need in order to deal with these headaches. So regular headaches occur without any of the additional symptoms that are associated with migraine. So it's not just, it is just a headache itself. And every now and then there might be something else. So for example, if you have a hangover and you have a headache, you might also be kind of nauseous or feel really lethargic or kind of dizzy. But those are kind of exceptional circumstances. For the most part, regular headaches are just the headache itself. And these are generally felt throughout the entire head. So the whole head is kind of throbbing or aching. And it's not something that's generalized to one specific location. Now, regular headaches can be of any duration and any severity, and there are several different common types that fall into this category. And the first is the most common type of headache that people tend to experience, and that is a tension type headache. And this is often described as a pain that feels like a tight band around the top of your head, or a pain that feels like a weight sitting on the top of your skull. And it's often associated with pain in the neck and or shoulder area. And many of you are probably sitting out there right now nodding your heads because that sounds familiar, and some of you might actually have some of these right now. A lot of us tend to develop them as we sit at work, at our desks, at our computers, We have tensions that arise because of what we're doing on a daily basis, because of relationships that are stressful, all sorts of things that make us feel anxiety. And all of this can make us kind of tense up, and that can lead to headaches. Tiredness as well, and also kind of poor posture just throughout your life, not just while you're sitting at a desk, can really contribute to these tension-type headaches. Now, what's interesting is that migraines often occur after a stressful incident has already finished, but tension-type headaches will occur beforehand, so as you're kind of anticipating it, you start to tense up, or even during those events when you're actually feeling the stress itself. And these can often be alleviated by making lifestyle changes that allow you to have better rest and better relaxation. So you can often use a lot of mental techniques, kind of like yoga or meditation, to try to calm yourself down so that you can deal with stress and pressure better. Another pretty common type of headache is a chronic daily headache. And these are headaches that occur for as equal to or more than 15 days per month, which sounds pretty miserable if you really add it all up and look at it as a bulk there. And chronic daily headaches are something that often can be associated with overuse of painkillers, and they may also be the result of chronic tension-type headaches or even chronic migraines. So this is a category that actually can be associated to all sorts of things, and really the bottom line is that you have to have a certain number of headaches per month to qualify for this. And these chronic daily headaches often occur early in the morning and can be associated with lots of other things like lack of appetite, nausea, restlessness, irritability, and concentration problems. And as I said, a lot of these are associated with overuse of painkillers, and that's because you can develop something that's known as a medication overuse or rebound headache. And that's the next one here on my list. And this happens particularly when you're using medication for the treatment of headaches. And so you'll have a headache and you'll take some pills, and then as the pills wear off, you'll get a new headache that develops because of the body's reaction to the termination of those drugs. So then you take some more drugs and you start the process all over again. And what's really unfortunate is that the intensity of the pain tends to increase as you use more and more drugs. So over time you have a worse and worse headache, and therefore are more and more inclined to take more drugs, but that only keeps the cycle going. And it's really the withdrawal from the meds that's causing that next headache. So it's really good if you can try to take medication and kind of, if you can avoid medication and kind of sever that relationship between having the pills and having the headache. Now, one of the reasons that these are quite common in the morning is that you have taken drugs the day before, but then they wear off overnight while you're sleeping, and then you suddenly don't have them anymore and your body is craving them. And so for that reason, these headaches will sometimes even wake people up in the middle of the night or quite early in the morning because the pain is already emerging in their sleep. Another type of regular headache that people often complain about is a sinus headache. And actually researchers think that a lot of these go misdiagnosed because people seem to interpret any pain in the sinus area as a sinus headache. In a true sinus headache, you've got pain located over the sinuses in the forehead area. Now, another thing that is increasingly common these days as we all use electronics, especially at work and at home, is headache that's caused by eye strain. And this is associated with weak eye muscles and can therefore get worse when you're reading or using a computer or doing other activities that involve a lot of eye movements. And this is something that really affects me a lot, and I feel these coming on towards the end of the day after I've been sat at my computer for hours and hours on end. And these can often be associated with blurred vision. So if you're having a headache and blurred vision while staring at a book or staring at a computer a lot, it's a pretty good sign that you're having an eye strain headache. And the good news is that you can often treat these with the help of corrective lenses. Glasses or contact lenses can really make all the difference. And the last headache that I want to mention before I move on to actually talking about migraines is quite an unusual condition known as cluster headache. And these are sometimes also called suicide headaches because they make people so miserable. And they're really not very well understood, and as a result of this, they're frequently misdiagnosed or mistreated. And these involve having really extreme head pain that lasts anywhere from just 15 minutes to up to 3 hours if they're not treated. And symptoms can include things like watering eyes, nasal congestion, facial sweating, drooping eyelids, and a lot of times the people who have them, they just can't stay still. They really feel itchy and they need to move around, and so they'll often pace a whole lot. And these frequently begin early in the morning and then can recur multiple times within a day, which is why they're called cluster headaches. Some researchers think that these stem from a disorder in the central nervous system, which means that even though it might be possible to eventually treat the symptoms of these quite well, it may not be possible for people who have cluster headaches to ever be fully cured. That was Lykke Li with Youth Knows No Pain. And today on the Wild Side we are talking about the pain of migraines. And before the break I was talking about the different types of quote-unquote regular headache that you might have experienced at some point in your life. And now I want to think a little bit more about migraines in particular. Now migraines are usually at least moderately painful and frequently can be really, really uncomfortable. And they frequently occur on only one side of the head. In particular, you might feel that you have this pain behind one eyeball. And they're often experienced in conjunction with other symptoms, such as nausea and vomiting, and sensitivity to stimuli like light and sound, and also visual disorders. And they usually last somewhere between 4 and 72 hours, and the associated symptoms that I just mentioned will often completely disappear in between migraine bouts. So these things are only associated with the migraine itself and will herald the arrival of a migraine and accompany a migraine while it's around, but then disappear again in between migraine bouts. Now, migraine sufferers are also 3 times more likely to have depression, although researchers they don't quite understand whether this is a cause or a consequence of the headaches themselves. Because certainly the impacts that migraines have on the quality of life and relationships can really be quite depressing. However, because this is something that is happening in your brain, it's possible that there is a particular trigger that affects both attitude and emotional state as well as the presence or absence of a headache. I'm sad to say that women are more likely to experience migraines than men are, and this is likely related to the fact that women have menstruation every month, and the hormone surges associated with that can cause migraines to happen. And so, of course, both sexes share certain triggers in common, and I'll talk a little bit more about triggers in a while, but this is one that women have all by themselves, and so they have this added thing that can cause them to suffer from migraines. Although children can also have migraine, they are more common in adults, and they usually don't begin to happen in children until they reach adolescence. And of course we know that adolescence is also a time when the hormones start to fluctuate a lot, so you can kind of see how that connection might be made. Now there are 2 different types of migraines. Well, there are 2 major types of migraines anyway. There are those that occur with aura and those that occur without aura. And aura is a neurological symptom of a migraine. They're predominantly visual, so things like blind spots and colored spots, sparkles and stars that appear before the eyes, flashing lights, tunnel vision, zigzag lines, temporary blindness, all sorts of fun things like that. However, you can also have non-visual aura, and those include things like numbness and tingling, so kind of a pins and needles sensation, weakness, dizziness, and even vertigo. And rarer types of aura include impairment to speech and hearing, also difficulty remembering things, feeling afraid and confused, and even experiencing partial paralysis or fainting. And these are often associated with pretty rare types of migraine that is associated with aura. So things like basilar type migraine, familiar hemiplegic migraine, sporadic hemiplegic migraine, things that most people probably won't ever experience. Other rarer types of migraine include retinal migraines, which involve only one eye and are associated with blind spots and other visual disturbances. Abdominal migraines, which sound truly miserable, and these occur usually just in children, and they're associated with loss of appetite, nausea, and vomiting. Menstrual headaches, which occur obviously only in women, within 2 days of the beginning or end of a period. And also something called status migrainosus, which are debilitating migraines that can last for several weeks on end. Now, migraines have distinct stages, and most people experience more than one stage, and it's even possible to experience some stages, so for example the aura stage, without ever going through other stages, so the headache stage, which is quite a weird thing. You can actually have a migraine without ever having a headache. And the presence of these stages is one of the things that helps doctors to distinguish between migraines and quote-unquote regular headaches. Now the first stage is the premonitory stage, and this involves a period when you've got physical and mental changes that are kind of heralding the arrival of a migraine. And this stage usually happens 1 to 24 hours before the headache. And you can experience things like tiredness, cravings for particular types of food, especially sugary foods, stiff neck, all sorts of things that are kind of associated with the type of migraine that you're going to get. Then you have the aura stage, if you are a person who experiences aura, and this usually lasts for about 5 to 60 minutes. This is followed eventually by the main attack, which is the headache itself. And then after this, which hopefully won't be too long, that 4 to 72 hour period that I mentioned earlier, you will experience the resolution and recovery stage, and this is also known as the post-drome stage. And usually you have a slow resolution where people just kind of gradually start to feel better and better. Maybe they've taken some drugs and it takes the drugs a while to kick in. But also there are some people that can have really quick resolution, and that's pretty common in people who will throw up when they have migraines. And so sometimes these people will vomit and then suddenly the headache is completely gone. So they've had to undergo the unpleasantness of throwing up, but then suddenly they are completely cured of all their symptoms. Now, one of the things I mentioned briefly earlier was something called a trigger. And these are things that can be associated with the migraine. And I won't say that they actually cause the migraine because researchers aren't exactly sure, but they do seem to be involved in creating the environment, at least, that makes migraines possible. And these can be events or changes in the lifestyle, external stimuli from the environment, a physical act. It can be really anything that's happening inside you or outside you or with you, which makes it very difficult sometimes to track these things down and figure out really what is involved in creating this migraine environment. And usually triggers occur not too long before the migraine, and there appears to be kind of a sweet period of 6 to 8 hours before the migraine has an onset that really seems to be important for determining whether or not you're going to get the headache. Some of the most common triggers are food and alcohol. So people will frequently avoid cheese, chocolate, citrus fruits, red wine. These are all things you've probably heard a friend mention, or you might try to avoid these if you're a sufferer of migraine. And these are often associated with a threshold rather than a presence or absence. So, for example, it might not be that you've had a piece of chocolate and therefore developed a headache, so much as you've had lots of chocolate over the past week or so, and so tomorrow you're going to wake up with a headache. And this is something that doctors are still trying to understand and really measure. And so we don't really know a whole lot about this, but it is kind of interesting to keep tabs on this, and that's something else I'll talk a bit more about later on, so that you can kind of figure out what your threshold is to make sure that you don't exceed it. Also, whether or not you've had food at all can be associated with having a migraine. So if you've not had quite enough food or quite enough water, you can put yourself in a migraine state. And one thing that's particularly interesting, kind of a subset of this group of triggers, is hypoglycemia. And hypoglycemia is a condition that results when you have too little blood sugar. And normally you would kind of fix this yourself. Your body self-regulates. It will fix when you've got too much blood sugar. That's what insulin is for. It will fix when you've got too little. That's what glucagon is for. But sometimes this doesn't happen. And so this can occur when you haven't eaten enough calories to maintain your homeostasis. For example, when you've skipped meals, when you're fasting, or when you're dieting. Maybe you've exercised without having eaten enough. Whatever the case, is that you can cause this imbalance in your body, and so that can trigger a migraine eventually. So it's really good if you have small, frequent, low-sugar meals, and avoid especially skipping breakfast, because you've already got a dearth of energy in your body from having not eaten for the last 8 hours or so. And also trying to avoid a lot of caffeine. So if you're someone who drinks coffee and tea, to try to limit yourself to maybe 4 or 5 cups a day, which actually sounds like quite a lot to me anyway, so maybe that wouldn't be too hard. But the nice thing is that all of these tips are really helpful for general health anyway, for keeping a good weight, for keeping a nice healthy lifestyle. So even if these things don't actually end up helping you with headaches, at least you're not doing your body any harm, and actually you're probably helping it out a bit. So it's certainly worth a try. Another common trigger of migraines is stress. So things like anxiety, excitement, tension, even things that are associated with really pleasant events can be causing enough stress to eventually help create that migraine situation. So maybe you're going on vacation and you're worrying about what you should pack, or have you got passports, are you going to make your plane, All those things are associated with a pleasant event, but they're still stressful enough to tip the balance and put you into a migraine realm. Environmental factors also can be a problem, so things like changes in routine, and that can be associated also with just kind of scheduling things, so maybe it's the weekend instead of the weekday, and so you sleep in a little bit, you eat at a different time. Changes in the weather, so things like air pressure and lighting and temperature, all these things, people will think you're absolutely crazy if you notice them and react to them, but actually they are things that can really affect whether or not you have a headache. Hormones I already mentioned, and sometimes these are associated with menstruation, as in the case of women, but also the hormones that are associated with stress. Also, having a lack of sleep or even too much sleep can be a trigger for migraine. And as I mentioned earlier with the eye strain headaches, computer use can also be a real problem in triggering migraines. So the glare from the screen, the position associated with computer use, even the kind of office environment where you've got certain types of light that maybe aren't as pleasant on your eyes, they're a bit too harsh. All of these things together can combine and make you really susceptible to getting a headache. And of course, one really important thing that you really can't do much about at all is genes. And a lot of people, actually the majority of people who suffer from migraines, are genetically predisposed to having them. So they aren't really a trigger per se, but they kind of fall within this category because they do put you in that state that makes you much more likely to have a migraine. And I, for example, have a mother who has migraines. My father actually ended up developing migraines late in life. My grandparents have migraines. My uncles have migraines. So this is clearly something that I was always going to be born with, no matter what. And that is actually true of lots and lots of people who have migraines. And genes, interestingly, not only predispose you to having a headache and what type of headache you're going to have, but also will be involved in creating those thresholds that I mentioned. So what levels you're tolerant to of these particular triggers and what combinations of triggers might lead to giving you a headache. And what you can imagine from listening to all of this is that it's a very complex process and there are very inconsistent patterns. Triggers often change over time as daily patterns change, as you have a new lifestyle emerging. You might come into contact with new triggers and suddenly develop new habits associated with migraines. And you might find that as you age, you kind of have changes in threshold. So this is something that you constantly have to be paying attention to in order to really be aware of what's going on. And that's something I'll talk a little bit more about after the break. That was Miranda Lambert with Maintain the Pain. And before the break, I was talking about triggers of migraine and all the different things that there are and how it can be really confusing to figure out what your triggers are and how different things might interact in order to make you susceptible to developing a migraine. But despite all that, there is actually something that you can do to try to understand your migraines a little bit more if you are a sufferer. And that is to create what's called a migraine diary. And this is something that can be really useful for you to understand your headaches and your patterns a bit better, and also can be really useful if you need to go to your physician and explain to them what's been happening to you and what's been associated with all these events that have been going on in your body. So if you're interested in keeping a migraine diary, there are kind of two categories of information that you should record. The first is information directly related to the migraine itself. So when did the head pain start? Where is it located? What does it feel like? How often do your headaches occur? How long are your attacks lasting? And what other symptoms, physical symptoms, are you experiencing? The other type of information is more general information about you and your lifestyle. So things like, when is food being consumed? What sorts of things are you eating? What other types of things like medications and vitamins and supplements are you also consuming? What is your exercise regime? How much sleep are you getting? And even things like, what are the weather conditions? Because I mentioned earlier that changes in environment can have a big impact on migraines. And things like changing air pressure, sunny days versus cloudy days, all these things can be enough to contribute to a migraine. And of course, if you're a woman, you should keep track of information associated with your menstrual cycle, because this is something else that can have a big influence on your headaches. And in fact, there is a particular class of migraines known as menstrual migraines that are very specific, to women, and that you have very specific medication to treat. So if you're able to keep that information, then doctors will know what kind of painkiller to give you to help you alleviate the pain. Now, speaking of that, actually, it's quite a nice segue, an accidental segue, into the topic of preventing and treating migraines. Now, unfortunately, there is no cure for migraine, but there are lots of techniques for making migraines more manageable. And the first of these I've just referred to is quite obvious, and that's drugs. And drugs can be taken as prophylactics, which means that they can try to prevent the migraine from happening at all, or they can be used as treatment once the migraine starts. And in that case, they're known as acute medications. Now, there are several different types of drugs that can be used for migraine. And prophylactics include things like beta blockers, which reduce the activity of brain cells that are involved in migraine. They also can prevent the widening of blood vessels. Oddly enough, tricyclic antidepressants, which is something that people obviously take so they don't feel depressed, and it has been found to have this kind of positive side effect of also alleviating headaches. And so now even people who aren't depressed are sometimes put on these pills in order to make them feel a bit better in terms of headaches. Another thing that kind of just had this unexpected side effect is an anticonvulsant, and these were originally used for the treatment of epilepsy, and somehow they also have this beneficial impact for migraine sufferers. And the action of these is unclear. No one really understands why they're having this positive effect on migraines, but they do. One final example of a prophylactic is actually antihistamines, which many of you probably take in order to deal with allergies that you have. So for instance, you might be on antihistamines now because of all of the flowering plants that are occurring here in the springtime. So maybe you are noticing also that you're having fewer headaches, hopefully. Acute drugs include things like analgesics, so these relieve pain and stiffness, so these are things you're really familiar with from over-the-counter settings, things like ibuprofen and paracetamol. Also antiemetics, which are drugs that can relieve the nausea that's often associated with migraines, and a special class of drugs that were developed specifically for migraines, which are called triptans. And triptans are serotonin agonists that were developed to narrow the blood vessels in the head and block transmission of the pain via nerves that are associated with the face. And triptans are often the thing that finally works for a lot of migraine sufferers who have tried lots of different drugs. And there are some really good ones out there. However, a lot of these do have some interesting and unpleasant side effects, so you often have to kind of experiment to find one that works right for you. And I find something really interesting about migraines is that you can go online and look through all these fora of people who have gotten together and talked about what regimes they've tried, what drugs they've tried, what works for them. And you can have people that describe having exactly the same symptoms, and then they'll try exactly the same drugs, and they don't work at all for one person and are great for another. So a lot of these things are really individual and quite specific, and you kind of have to try a lot of different things to figure out what works for you. And I know that certainly over the years I've tried maybe a half dozen to 10 different migraine drugs before finding one that finally worked for me. Another interesting thing about the types of drugs that are out there being used is that people used to really frequently use prophylactics and try to prevent the migraines from ever surfacing. But a lot of those have very negative side effects. For example, I was on one that made you really, really groggy, so that when you woke up, maybe for the first 3 or 4 hours of the day, you just could not focus on anything. And obviously that's not something that's very useful if you need to go to work or get the kids ready for school or do whatever you do early in the day. And so people moved away from those and are now using more and more acute treatments, which pharmaceutical companies have really invested in quite heavily, and so they've developed lots of really good ones. So acute treatments are now much better than they used to be, which means that it is possible now to move away from prophylactics into these drugs that treat headaches after they've already appeared. Now, if you're not into drugs per se, and you want to try something that's maybe a bit more natural, then maybe you can go for Botox treatment. And at the same time, of course, that will maybe give you a bit of a cosmetic boost, who knows. But Botox is diluted botulinum toxin, which is produced by the bacterium Clostridium botulinum. And you've probably heard of Botox, but you may not have understood what it actually was. And really, you're kind of infecting yourself on purpose with botulism. And botulism is a really unpleasant thing that can lead to death, and this is what you're trying to avoid whenever you eat canned food. So if you see canned food with a bit of swelling, then it's probably got botulism because the bacteria in there have been really active and they've produced gases, and that's what's swelling the can. So botulism from a can, bad, but Botox can be quite good, not just for smoothing out the wrinkles of your forehead as you're going through your midlife crisis, but also for treating spasticity and cramps and pain, and now migraine. And what's kind of fun about this is that people actually had no intention to treat migraines with Botox. It was a complete accident where they were treating these women for cosmetic purposes, and a subset of them noticed that they were also having fewer headaches after being treated with Botox. And so they did all these clinical trials to try to investigate this further, and they had really disappointing results. It turned out that very few people actually experienced these same benefits. But once they looked into this even further, they found out that it seems to be a subset of people that are actually very much in need of any kind of medication. So it's just the people that have really serious chronic migraines where they're suffering for 20 or more days every month. And these women were the ones that were responding quite well to treatment with Botox. And the mechanism behind this is not really understood. So even though Botox in general works by relaxing your muscles and kind of paralyzing you, this is probably not why it has a beneficial effect on migraine sufferers. It probably is related somehow to the release of neurotransmitters that are associated with pain processing. So somehow the treatment with Botox prevents these neurotransmitters from being released and therefore alleviates the feeling of pain. That was Turin Breaks with Painkiller from the Last Kiss soundtrack. And you are listening to The Wild Side on Source 96.1 FM. And I am talking about painkillers today in the context of having migraines. And just before the break, I was talking about some of the ways that people can try to alleviate the pain and suffering associated with migraines. And first I talked about painkillers, and then I moved on to Botox, and now I want to think a little bit about herbs and supplements. And these are things that are increasingly of interest to people who suffer from migraines because they're sick of taking a whole bunch of pharmaceutical products and they're hoping to find something a bit more natural. Now, of course, that's not really the best way to think about this because herbs and supplements can also be quite unnatural if you take them in large quantities. And also a lot of the pharmaceuticals that we take are things that are simply made from natural products anyway. And so you have to be quite careful if you're going to go out and do these things. You need to discuss them with a doctor, but they can, in many cases, be quite healthy for you. They're not going to have any negative side effects. They might actually have nice kind of general effects on your health. And so some of them are definitely worth a try if you want to avoid taking more pills. Now, the first group that I want to talk about are things that are already in your diet, but you can take them in larger quantities in order to try to prevent migraines from happening or treat them once they occur. So one of these is magnesium, which is important in lots of different physiological processes. And if you look in an average adult, you're going to find about 24 grams of magnesium. And this has been accumulated in the body from things like spices and nuts, cereals and tea and veggies and all sorts of things that most of us eat every day. Now, migraine sufferers have been found to have low brain magnesium during their migraine attacks and also to have general magnesium deficiencies. And this seems to be particularly important in cases of migraines that are associated with menstruation. And so once these things were noticed, people said, well, maybe we should start taking magnesium in order to try to combat this and prevent the headaches from happening at all. And in fact, 2 controlled studies have found that there are beneficial effects of magnesium, though there are also some studies that have found contradictory results or found that it's completely neutral and it has really not got a big impact at all. So this is something that's still being researched and people are still trying to find out whether magnesium can really make much of a difference. Something that seems to be a bit more successful is a vitamin known as riboflavin or B2. And this is needed to convert food into energy. And it's found in things like legumes and nuts and leafy greens, dairy and lean meats. Again, the sorts of things you would eat anyway, but maybe not in the quantities you should. So actually having a little bit of B2 anyway, just in excess of what you're eating, is not a bad idea, and it may actually help you with migraines. So for example, there was a short-term study that was conducted several years ago that found that migraine sufferers had about 50% fewer attacks when they were taking riboflavin supplements. However, this is the only study that's been done, and it only lasted for 3 months, and so that's really not the most convincing evidence that this is something that should be rolled out to all migraine sufferers. Another vitamin and supplement that kind of tops the list of things that could be potentially quite useful is coenzyme Q10. And this is involved in the creation of adenosine triphosphate, which you probably have heard more commonly referred to as ATP. And ATP is what we use to fuel our bodies. It's our source of energy. And coenzyme Q10 also works as an antioxidant, which you always hear about antioxidants in the news, how they can help you live longer and look more youthful and all these wonderful things. And while some of those things might not be true, they are generally quite good to have in your body. And you can find coenzyme Q10 in small amounts in things like meat and oily fish and organ meats, and also in whole grains. And a lot of those are things that people tend to avoid, so actually having a bit of a supplement that gives you more of this is definitely something that can balance a lot of people's diets. And this particular type of supplementation can take quite a long time to work, but once it does kick in after maybe 3, 4, 5 months, it can result in dramatic reductions in migraines. And this has been found not just in adults, but also particularly in children who suffer from migraines. So those are the dietary supplements that seem to be most likely to help with people who suffer from migraines. There are also a couple of herbs that are worth mentioning. The first of these is feverfew, which, as you might guess from the name, has traditionally been used to treat fevers, and also for asthma and dermatitis, arthritis, and menstrual pain. And all of these are things that have been kind of more recent developments in the use of feverfew. This actually is something that has been used as a traditional and folk medicine for a really long time. Now, in addition to kind of moving into these other realms of medicine, feverfew has also been applied to migraine. And there have been 2 clinical studies that found that people who take feverfew in a preventative way have fewer headaches and also fewer associated symptoms when they do have their headaches. So that's quite promising. Something else that looks quite promising is butterbur, which was traditionally used as a herbal remedy for pain, fever, and spasms. And it's now used mainly for headaches and asthma. Now, in its natural form, butterbur is actually quite toxic, and I believe it impacts either your kidneys or your liver, I forget which now. But once it's processed, you can buy a safe version from a pharmaceutical company. And several studies have found that butterbur is useful for both adults and children. And some of the reductions in migraine are really extreme, so something on the order of 50 to 75% fewer migraines that are experienced by people who are taking butterbur as a herbal remedy. So that's definitely something that would be of interest to anyone who's suffering from quite a lot of headaches, or even just a few headaches, because these things are really uncomfortable. So maybe you're the type of person who doesn't really like the idea of pills, you don't like the idea of Botox, I wouldn't like the idea of Botox either, you don't like the idea of supplements. What else can you possibly do to help get rid of your migraines? Well, there are several things that people have suggested in the past that are kind of psychological. So the meditation, which I mentioned earlier, kind of the biofeedback where you think quite hard about the various bits of your body and try to relax them and concentrate on where the pain is coming from and flowing to. And those are quite valid. I have friends that have had a lot of success with those. But the last thing that I want to mention is something that I've actually found quite a lot of relief from, which is exercise. And that's quite interesting because in many people, exercise can act as a trigger for migraines. And this is particularly true if the exercise kind of comes out of nowhere, so if you haven't done anything for a few days or a few years, if you're too strenuous, if it's performed without enough food and water, if you do it out in really uncomfortable conditions, like maybe it's really hot or it's really humid. But in a lot of people, it can also be quite useful because it helps you relieve stress. It gets you up and moving around so you're not sitting hunched over your computer in an awkward position. And it also can release endorphins, which are the body's natural painkillers, as well as things that make you quite happy. So activities like jogging and swimming and dancing and cycling and my favorite, walking, are all things that are good because they can be done quite regularly without going, out of your way to bring these into your daily routine. And they can also be done at mild intensities. And this is really important because you don't want to do too much exercise because you could trigger a migraine. So you don't want to go out and run a marathon necessarily, but to go out for a little jog every day can be really helpful. And a lot of doctors suggest that something like 3 30-minute routines per week are a useful place to start, and then you can do more than that if you're feeling quite healthy. And some cases, the results from this regime might not be seen for up to 6 weeks or more. So if you start this and you don't find yourself really benefiting, hang in there and do it for a bit longer and see if eventually things get a bit better for you. And that really wraps up all that I want to say today about migraines. One last comment is that you might notice that I didn't talk too much about the mechanism behind migraines. And that's because actually this is something that is not very well understood. I mentioned earlier that this is the least publicly funded of all neurological illnesses, and for that reason we have some ideas about where migraines come from, but not too many and in not very much detail. Now, of course, I'm not a doctor, or at least I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't really give you any advice about migraines, and I didn't intend today's show to stand in the place of a visit to your doctor. However, if any of this stuff was useful or interesting to you, then you should thank a particular website where I went to get all of this information, and that is the migrainetrust.org. And it's a great website that has even more stuff than I mentioned on air today, and talks about particular types of migraine, whether you're a woman or a man or a child, what type of migraines and symptoms and experiences might you have. And it lists lots of advice about things you can do to try to alleviate the pain of migraines in your own life. And it also has a place where you can donate money if you like, so that you can help to fund additional migraine research to help try to make some advances in the study of this condition and some improvements in the lives of the millions and millions of people who are affected by these worldwide. I will put the link to the website on the Wildside webpage so that you can visit it and find out all the things that I didn't mention today, or maybe even refresh your memory of what I did talk about. I'm going to close today by playing Trio singing The Pain of Loving You. And until next week, that is all from me.